Hi, I'm Melissa Ashley. I'm an author. My latest novel is called The Naturalist of Amsterdam, and it's inspired by a woman called Maria Sibylla Merian. She was born in 1647, and she's known as one of the world's first ecologists. Well, she is the world's first ecologist, and she was also one of the first Europeans to study insect metamorphosis. So back then, insects were thought of as evil, probably from the Bible, but they were also thought to spontaneously generate from mud or from rotting meat. People didn't realise they came from eggs. Maria fell in love with studying the life cycles of insects when she was 13. And so when she was in her early 50s with her daughter Dorothea, she self-funded a trip to Suriname in South America, and they collected and studied and drew its wonderful butterflies, moths, insects, but also its plants. And they returned to Amsterdam and put out one of the most beautiful works of natural history that was ever published, called The Metamorphosis of the Insects of Suriname, and it was published in 1705. And the stories told from the perspective of Dorothea, who she tries to forge an identity for herself. She tries to figure out who she is, just under the shadow of a very demanding and brilliant and genius mother. My publisher is Affirm Press here in Melbourne. She has a really interesting legacy, particularly as the world's first ecologist. So back in the day, people were either collecting insects and pinning them on boards and having people come to their home museums and look at them, or scientists who were doing very early natural history were really describing the shape of a butterfly or the shape of a caterpillar, and they weren't interested in the processes, the life cycle processes of the caterpillars and the butterflies and the plants that they lived on and they spun their webs on and or their cocoons. And so Maria did this. So she really studied the living creatures. She had nurseries at home and she brought them up and she fed them and she painted them and she wrote scientific observations of them. And she's really interesting because this is at a cross between art and science too. I've sort of walked around with Maria for about 9 years in my head, and I discovered her when I was researching for my first book, The Birdman's Wife, and I really wanted to write about her, but there's quite a lot of biographical, there are PhDs, there's quite a lot of material published about her. And I kept trying to find a way to enter into her story, and I discovered that her daughters helped her in her home studio. She had another daughter, Joanna, and then I discovered there was a book written about that, a study, which was really fascinating. And then I discovered that after Maria died, Dorothea went to St. Petersburg to work for Peter the Great. And this sort of gave me the final piece of the jigsaw, really, to have my point of view and to write about Dorothea, because as a historical fiction writer, she gave me more leeway to invent a character, because there's a lot about Maria and she's kind of a very powerful person and you can get a strong idea of what she was like. It did involve a lot of research writing this book, because Maria and Dorothea, they constructed their books from the very first stages all the way to the end. So Maria was an artist. So first of all, she studied the insects and wrote about them scientifically, but then she composed the illustrations, she etched them, and she had a printing press in her own home. So she printed them, she published them, and then she also had a bookshop. And so she sold them from her own shop. And she was an art teacher, and she made paintbrushes and she made pigments and she made gums and she sold them to her students. So every single step of it all, I had to do some research into those various areas as well. I went to Amsterdam. I was on another research project, and I went to a big part of it that was helpful. I went to Rembrandt's house, and he has a studio at the top of his house, which is a sort of a reenactment of what his original studio was like. And just seeing the pigments and the paintbrushes and the stove and the gums and the ochres and everything that he worked with is really helpful for me as a historical fiction writer, because a lot of your research is from books, and I wrote it during COVID, so I had to do lots of internet research. So sort of coming close to that tactile world is really helpful for me, I think, to write about it in an authentic way. And also I collected some books as well that Maria had published. The Metamorphosis of the Insects of Suriname was published in 2019. It was the anniversary of 350 years anniversary since she was born. And so it was a reproduction of this beautiful book, which is about this big. And so I bought that, and that was fantastic. And I also imported some books from St. Petersburg, that publications of some really important manuscripts and documents held in that collection. So I really do discover the person, because I'm very interested in telling the stories of women who've made contributions to our world culture, to literature, to art, to science. And I discover a person, and I often discover them while I'm doing another research project, so they grow out of that. And I wander around with them in my head for a while, but I have to find out how to tell the story. I have to figure out, because they have these great, enormous lives and so many events happen in them. So I need to find out my way to go in, and what I can do as a historical fiction writer, which is to give the emotional and the interior side of the story of this incredible archive that they've left behind, the record of their life. That was a bit of a tussle to figure out how to tell the story. And originally I had it took place over a shorter period of time than the final book has been set. So the book starts with the point of view character Dorothea when she's about 8, and it goes all the way up to her. She's in her late 30s. So we really cover quite a trajectory of her life, and I home in on some of the important and really interesting things that she did, like go to Suriname. She was in the Labardist cult, which was a doomsday cult. She married a ship surgeon. And sort of the first part of the book is about that. And then later on in her life, we sort of come to a later part of her life. And this is where she finds her new self and finds her identity. So, yeah, figuring out how to structure it is a very interesting, something that you tussle with a lot as a historical fiction writer, because I do really want to be faithful to the record. And that's what I have done with all of my books. And the record, obviously, you have to go into certain places, and I don't take a lot of liberties. Yeah, so that's something I have to consider all the way through drafting the book. I'm really interested in telling the stories of women who have been forgotten and have contributed to science, art, medicine in some way, and we just don't know about them. I think there's a huge hunger in audiences to find out about them. We're really interested in stories that haven't been told, like we're very familiar with certain versions of history. And I'm just so fascinated by these people that I discovered. I discovered Elizabeth Gould from my first book, The Birdman's Wife, from my love of birdwatching. And I'd never intended to be a historical fiction writer, but I just fell in love with her. And then Mary Catherine Dolnoy, the main character in The Bee and the Orange Tree, my next book, the same. I discovered there were these French fairy tale writers who contributed to fairy tales, but we only remember Perrault. We don't realise, or the Grimms, we don't realise the female literary background to it. And then with Maria Sibylla Merian, she was such an extraordinary person, and most people don't know who she is. And that's like such a wonderful person to bring to readers. So I do have gaps in my writing, and often when my book's with the publisher, going through its edits and through that process, I research, and I do a lot of research, and it takes me quite some time researching the characters, like a couple of years before I start writing the book. And even when I'm writing, I sometimes break off to do research, because some of my writing, it's quite intricate with certain details. So I suppose I might not physically be writing, but I'm walking around with the characters in my mind and thinking about them. And I'm writing a new book at the moment, and I'm spending so much time thinking about what the story is just in my mind. One of my favourite books that I've read this year is Emily O'Grady's book. She's a Brisbane writer, called Feast. That was really wonderful. And I've just started reading another book by a writer called Rachel Mead, which is about the very first Australian woman to go to Antarctica, and she's stowed away on a ship, and I'm really loving that. She's a poet, and she's got the most beautiful lyrical language. I read all sorts of fiction, and I read a lot of research as well. So I really love literary fiction. That's kind of my first love, contemporary literary fiction, and from all over the world. I'm writing a new novel set in Italy in the 18th century, and it's about a woman who was an anatomist, and she was also a wax sculptor. So she prepared anatomical parts and then sculpted them into wax. And that was to teach medical students, because you could only do anatomy in winter. And so that was like a big step forward. So she's just a fascinating woman. So I'm looking into her life at the moment. Thanks so much for having me.